All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are talking about something that's been on my mind a lot lately, monitor calibration. And to help us unpack this surprisingly complex topic, we're diving into an article by Frank Glencairn. It's called The Hidden Truths of Monitor Calibration, and let me tell you, this guy does not hold back. He's got some strong opinions about cheaper calibration tools being, and I quote, worse than nothing, especially for professionals. So we're going to try to figure that out today. If you're thinking about calibrating your monitor, but you're not sure if it's worth the investment or what pitfalls to avoid, you are in the right place. Let's unpack Glencairn's argument and see what's what.
He's definitely not mincing words, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's easy to get sucked in by those cheaper options, but Glencairn's argument is all about the tech. We're talking about the difference between how these tools actually measure color.
So colorimeters versus spectroradiometers?
Yeah.
Those are some seriously fancy words.
You got that right. Imagine trying to bake a cake, but you're only allowed to use your eyes to measure the ingredients, like a pinch of this, a dash of that.
Okay, yeah, like those old cooking shows where they don't even use measuring cups. That could go either way, right?
Exactly. And that's kind of what a colorimeter is doing. It's basically measuring color, like a simplified camera sensor, with red, green, and blue filters. But that can be pretty easily thrown off by how different monitors actually display color.
So even if a color looks correct on a nicely calibrated screen, it might look totally different somewhere else.
That's the risk. Another issue is that those cheaper probes can heat up during use, which further impacts their accuracy. It's like trying to measure a piece of fabric as it stretches and pulls in the heat, right? You're not going to get a reliable reading.
Consistency is a problem too, huh?
And then you've got another big one, low light performance. Glencairn says that a lot of cheaper probes have trouble accurately measuring the subtle gradations in dark areas of the screen. And that's super important for things like HDR content.
It's like those nature documentaries where you can suddenly see all the details in the shadows. We're talking the fur on a panther, the veins on a leaf. Those cheaper probes might miss that.
Yeah, it's almost like they have their own version of night blindness.
They struggle in the dark. So Glencairn goes on and on about how these cheaper probes can't accurately measure below something like 0.1 CD/M2. Honestly, I don't even know what that means. But he's got this whole thing about how to measure those super dark areas below 10% brightness.
It's all about detail. Imagine you're a filmmaker, right? And you're working on this really dimly lit scene. Or maybe you're a photographer trying to capture a stunning night sky. You need those subtle shadows, those gradations to make the image really come alive.
So for certain types of work, it actually does matter.
Absolutely. It's the difference between an image that falls flat and one that really draws you in. And that's where Glencairn's saying those cheaper probes just can't keep up.
Okay, that makes sense. But is he saying to go all out on this expensive equipment even if you're not a pro?
He makes a really compelling case that if you're the kind of person who needs to know those colors are going to be perfect every single time, a high-end spectroradiometer is the only way to go. Like, he's really passionate about it.
Okay, so that's like your professional photographer, maybe a video editor working on a big budget film.
Right, exactly. Someone who absolutely needs to nail those colors.
But it makes that whole worse than nothing argument feel a little dramatic, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
For the average person like me, someone who just browses the web and watches Netflix, it's probably not a huge deal, right?
I think you're right. This is where it comes down to your individual needs, right? And not everyone needs that crazy level of color accuracy.
So how do people figure that out? How do our listeners know if they need to shell out the big bucks for one of these top-of-the-line calibration systems, or if they can get away with something a little more, budget-friendly?
Well, I think it all comes down to your needs, your budget, and how much you value color accuracy in your digital life.
I was hoping for an easy answer. But let's break it down for our listeners, okay? Let's say you're someone who considers themselves a pretty casual user. We're talking browsing the web, checking email, scrolling through social media, watching movies, that kind of thing. What's the verdict for them?
I'd say for most casual users, your monitor's default settings are probably just fine.
Seriously. Even those super basic ones.
Especially with newer monitors, a lot of them actually come pretty well calibrated straight out of the box.
That's good to know.
A cheaper calibration tool might help, but it's not guaranteed to be a huge improvement, And if the software is really basic, you might not even be able to do that much anyway.
Okay, so for casual users, maybe not worth it. But what about the people in between? The photography hobbyists, the gamers who are really into their visuals, graphic designers who are just starting out?
And that's where Glencairn's point about different color spaces and stuff really comes in. But that's a whole other deep dive, probably.
It's a rabbit hole. very colorful one.
For those folks, though, I think a mid-range probe could be a good option. You're going to get more control over things, and the software is going to be more tailored to those
A
needs.
good compromise.
Exactly.
Not the cheapest option,
Mhm.
but not breaking the bank either.
Yeah.
And for the pros, it sounds like Glenn Cairn's advice holds true. If you're serious about color, get the tools that match right.
You need the right tools for the job.
This whole conversation has been a trip.
Mm.
Glenn Cairn really pushes us to think differently about the colors we see on our screens.
And that's what's so fun about this stuff, right?
So even if you decide not to run out and buy a calibrator tomorrow, at least you're thinking about color in a new way, which is pretty cool. It's like we're suddenly aware of this whole hidden world of color science happening right on our screens.
It's true. And you know what? It's kind of like tuning a musical instrument, right? If it's even a little bit off, the whole thing just sounds wrong.
Ooh, I like that.
And most importantly, only you can decide how precise that tuning really needs to be.
Okay, so let's bring it back to Glenn Cairn's article. He's very pro-calibration, even argues that a cheap probe is better than nothing. But after all this, I'm wondering, is there ever a time when someone's better off just skipping calibration altogether?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right. Like, is there a situation where it could actually make things worse?
You know, Glenn Cairn's right. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. It all boils down to you, your needs, your budget, how much you really care about accurate color in your digital life.
It's about finding that balance. Not everyone needs to be a color ninja.
Exactly. For most everyday users, your monitor's factory settings are probably just fine, honestly.
Okay, yeah, that makes me feel better.
And hey, here's a little bonus tip just for our listeners. A lot of devices have settings to adjust the color temperature.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, you can usually make things warmer or cooler. It's a simple tweak, but it can make a really big difference.
Good to know. So don't stress about the fancy equipment unless you actually need it. But maybe don't ignore the power of a little color adjustment either.
Nailed it. The most important thing is that you're enjoying what you see. If the colors on your screen are making you happy, you're doing it right.
I love that. That's a
Yeah.
great place to end it. This has been so fun. I always learned so much from our little deep dives.
Me too. It's awesome to geek out about color with you and everyone listening.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the surprisingly complex world of monitor calibration. Big thanks to our listeners for joining us. Until next time, happy viewing.